The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Harold Mitchell climbed them slowly, his worn leather shoes making soft sounds against the concrete. At 72 years old, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had seen better days, though his posture remained straight and dignified. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his simple blue suit, though clearly not expensive, was pressed and clean. Harold paused at the top of the steps, looking up at the imposing facade of the county courthouse. Today was the day he would face Judge Morrison about the property dispute with his neighbor. It seemed like such a small thing, really. A fence line that had been moved 6 inches onto his land, a garden shed that blocked his view of the mountains he had loved for the past 15 years. But his neighbor, Robert Chen, was a successful businessman with expensive lawyers, and Harold was just a retired old man living on a modest pension. Inside the courthouse, the morning bustle was already underway. Lawyers in sharp suits hurried past, their briefcases swinging as they navigated between clusters of people waiting for their cases to be heard. Harold found a wooden bench near the back of the hallway and sat down quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He watched the chaos around him with patient eyes, the same eyes that had seen far more dramatic scenes in places most of these people could never imagine. "Mitchell versus Chen," called the bailiff. "Property dispute, courtroom 3. Harold stood up slowly and made his way to the designated courtroom. The space was smaller than he had expected, with about 30 wooden seats facing the judge's bench. Most of the seats were already filled with people waiting for their own cases. Harold took a seat in the 3rd row and waited. Robert Chen arrived 15 minutes later with 2 lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. Chen was a man in his 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Harold's monthly pension. His lawyers both carried expensive leather briefcases and moved with the confident swagger of people who rarely lost. They took seats at the front table, spreading out documents and whispering among themselves. Harold's lawyer, if you could call him that, was actually a recent law school graduate named Tommy Reeves who worked for the county's legal aid office. Tommy was a good kid, with a sincere desire to help people, but he was clearly nervous about going up against Chen's high-powered legal team. He sat beside Harold, fidgeting with his papers and stealing glances at the opposition. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," announced the bailiff. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had built a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She was known to be fair, but impatient with people who wasted her time. She settled into her chair and looked down at the case file. "This is a property line dispute between Mr. Chen and Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Mr. Chen, you're claiming that the current fence line has been in place for over 20 years and constitutes the legal boundary between the properties." Chen's lead lawyer, a polished man named David Harrison, stood up. "That's correct, Your Honor. My client purchased his property 15 years ago with the understanding that the current fence line represented the legal boundary. Mr. Mitchell's recent claim that the fence encroaches on his property is without merit and appears to be motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate legal grounds." Harold felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his expression remained calm. Personal animosity, as if wanting to keep the land he had paid for was somehow petty. Judge Morrison turned to Tommy Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, what's your client's position?" Tommy stood up, his nervousness obvious. "Your Honor, we have a survey from last month that clearly shows the fence is 6 inches onto Mr. Mitchell's property. We also have documentation showing that when Mr. Mitchell purchased his property 15 years ago, the fence was in the correct location. It was moved sometime in the past 10 years. "Do you have proof of when the fence was moved?" Judge Morrison asked. Tommy shuffled through his papers. We have photographs from Mr. Mitchell showing the original fence location." Harrison immediately objected. "Your Honor, those photographs are not properly authenticated and there's no way to verify when they were taken." Judge Morrison nodded. sustained. "Mr. Reeves, do you have any other evidence?" Harold watched as his young lawyer struggled with the case. The truth was, they didn't have much. Harold had been so trusting when he bought the property, so focused on finally having a peaceful place to spend his retirement, that he hadn't thought to document every detail. He had simply assumed that honest people would deal with each other honestly. The proceeding continued for another hour, with Chen's lawyers presenting a polished case full of legal precedents and technical arguments. They painted Harold as an old man who was confused about property lines and trying to take advantage of a successful businessman. They suggested that Harold's claims were the product of age-related confusion, or perhaps even early dementia. Harold sat quietly through it all, his hands folded, his expression neutral. He had learned long ago that sometimes you had to endure things that weren't fair, that didn't make sense, that hurt your pride. You endured them because fighting back wasn't always possible or wise. Tommy did his best, but it was clear that he was outmatched. His arguments were technically correct but lacked the polish and authority of Harrison's presentation. Judge Morrison listened with growing impatience, checking her watch several times as the morning wore on. "Mr. Reeves," the judge finally said, "I appreciate your efforts, but I'm not seeing compelling evidence that the fence was moved. Property lines can be established by long-standing use, and Mr. Chen's evidence suggests the current line has been in place for many years." Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. He was going to lose. After working his entire life, after serving his country for more years than most of these people had been alive, he was going to lose 6 inches of his land and his mountain view because he couldn't afford better lawyers. Just as Judge Morrison was about to render her decision, the courtroom doors opened with a soft creak. Harold didn't turn around, but he heard the quiet, measured footsteps of someone entering the room. The footsteps had a particular cadence, a rhythm that spoke of military training and high rank. Harrison was in the middle of his closing argument when he paused, his attention caught by whoever had entered. Judge Morrison also looked toward the back of the courtroom, and her expression changed slightly. Even the bailiff seemed to straighten up. "General Patterson," Judge Morrison said with obvious surprise, "this is unexpected." Harold's head turned slowly. Standing in the back of the courtroom was a man in his 60s wearing a crisp army dress uniform with the stars of a 2-star general on his shoulders. General Patterson was tall and lean, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command. His presence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. "Your Honor," General Patterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I apologize for the interruption. I was supposed to meet with the county commissioners about the new Veterans Memorial, but I believe I may have relevant information about this case." Harrison looked confused. "Your Honor, I object to this irregular procedure." Judge Morrison held up her hand. "General, what kind of relevant information?" General Patterson's eyes swept the courtroom until they found Harold. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other, and something passed between them that the rest of the courtroom couldn't understand. "Your Honor," the general said slowly, "I believe there may be more to Mr. Mitchell than has been presented to the court today." Harold felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his expression remained calm. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't planned for anyone from his past to walk into this small-town courtroom on this particular morning. General Patterson walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, his eyes never leaving Harold's face. As he got closer, his gaze dropped to Harold's suit jacket, specifically to the small, barely visible pin on his left lapel. It was a simple pin, nothing flashy, just a small piece of metal that most people would overlook entirely. But General Patterson didn't overlook it. His steps slowed as he recognized what he was seeing, and his expression changed from curiosity to something approaching awe. The pin was small and dark, almost black. with a simple design that looked like nothing more than a geometric pattern to most observers. But to someone with the right knowledge, the right background, it told a very different story. Harold felt the weight of decades pressing down on him as the general's recognition became clear. He had worn that pin for so many years that he barely thought about it anymore. It was just part of his daily routine, like putting on his watch or combing his hair. He had never expected anyone in this small town to know what it meant. General Patterson stopped about 6 feet from Harold's seat. The courtroom had gone completely quiet, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. "Your Honor," General Patterson said, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "before you make your decision in this case, I believe the court should know exactly who Mr. Harold Mitchell is." Judge Morrison frowned. "I have his identification and background information, General. He's a retired maintenance worker." "No, Your Honor," General Patterson said quietly. "He's much more than that." Harold closed his eyes briefly. After all these years of quiet retirement, of being just another old man in a small town, his past was about to catch up with him. Part of him was relieved. Part of him was terrified. The general's eyes returned to the small pin on Harold's jacket. "Your Honor, that pin Mr. Mitchell is wearing is not something you can buy in a store. It's not something you can earn through ordinary service. It's only given to members of the most elite unit in the United States military." Harrison stood up, clearly frustrated. "Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. This man's military service, whatever it may be, has no bearing on this property dispute." Judge Morrison looked uncertain. "General Patterson, I appreciate Mr. Mitchell's service, but I'm not sure how this relates to the fence line issue." General Patterson turned to face the judge directly. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to tell you exactly what that pin means and why the man wearing it deserves the court's respect and attention." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Chen's lawyers seemed to sense that something important was happening, though they clearly didn't understand what. Harold remained seated, his hands still folded, his expression neutral. But inside, his mind was racing back through the years. Through memories of places and operations that most people didn't even know existed. He thought about young men who had followed him into impossible situations, who had trusted him with their lives, who had come home because of decisions he had made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Judge Morrison looked from General Patterson to Harold and back again. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, General. You have the court's attention." General Patterson straightened to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of military history and hard-earned respect. "Your Honor, the pin that Mr. Mitchell wears is the distinctive insignia of Delta Force, the Army's most classified special operations unit. But more than that, the specific design of his pin indicates that he wasn't just a member of Delta Force. He was a team leader, a man who commanded some of the most dangerous and sensitive missions in modern military history. The courtroom erupted in whispers and shuffling as people turned to stare at Harold. But Harold himself remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if he were seeing something that had happened long ago and far away. Tommy Reeves looked at his client with wide eyes, suddenly understanding that he had been representing someone he knew nothing about. Chen and his lawyers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly trying to figure out how this development might affect their case. But Judge Morrison was looking directly at Harold now, and her expression had changed completely. The impatient judge who had been ready to dismiss an old man's property claim was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of who was sitting in her courtroom. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "is this true?" Harold looked up at her for the first time since General Patterson had entered the room. His eyes were calm and steady, but there was something in them now that hadn't been there before, a depth and intensity that spoke of experiences beyond the imagination of most people. "Yes, Your Honor," he said simply. "It's true." The two words hung in the air like a confession and a revelation all at once. In that moment, everything changed. The quiet old man who had been dismissed and overlooked was suddenly someone else entirely, someone whose presence carried weight and whose story was about to transform everything everyone thought they knew about this simple property dispute. The silence in the courtroom stretched on as the full weight of General Patterson's revelation settled over everyone present. Judge Morrison found herself looking at Harold Mitchell with completely new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man before her with the image of an elite Special Forces commander. General Patterson remained standing, his posture reflecting the deep respect he clearly felt for Harold. "Your Honor, if I may continue, I think it's important for the court to understand exactly what Mr. Mitchell's service meant." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Please proceed, General." "Delta Force operators are selected from the best soldiers in the Army, men who have already proven themselves in combat and demonstrated exceptional skills. But even among Delta Force, team leaders are special. They're chosen not just for their tactical abilities, but for their judgment under extreme pressure, their ability to make life and death decisions in seconds, and their capacity to inspire absolute trust from the men under their command." Harold shifted slightly in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention, but knowing there was no escape from it now. He had spent 15 years in this small town, being nobody special, just another retiree working in his garden and reading books on his front porch. That anonymity was disappearing with each word the general spoke. Harrison, Chen's lead lawyer, stood up again. "Your Honor, while I certainly respect Mr. Mitchell's military service, I still don't see how this changes the facts of the property dispute." General Patterson turned to look at Harrison with an expression that could freeze water. "Mr. Harrison, let me ask you something. In your experience, have you found that men who spent decades making life-and-death decisions under the most extreme circumstances are generally prone to confusion about simple property boundaries?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Tommy Reeves was frantically scribbling notes, suddenly realizing that his case had taken a dramatic turn. He looked at Harold with a mixture of awe and confusion, wondering how he could have sat next to this man for weeks without knowing anything about his background. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to tell the court about your military service?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his hands still folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried undertones of experiences that most people could never imagine. "I served in the Army for 28 years, Your Honor. The last 15 of those years were with what the General calls Delta Force, though we usually just called it the unit. I led a 12-man team on operations in places that most people have never heard of." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I retired in 1995 with the rank of Sergeant Major. I moved here because I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, where I could tend a garden and watch the mountains change with the seasons." General Patterson nodded approvingly. "Your Honor, Sergeant Major Mitchell's record is extraordinary even by Delta Force standards. His team conducted operations in Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, and a dozen other places where American interests were at stake, but where conventional forces couldn't be deployed." The general's voice took on a tone of deep respect. "In 1993, during the Battle of Mogadishu, Sergeant Major Mitchell's team was responsible for extracting wounded Rangers and Delta operators from the crash sites of 2 Black Hawk helicopters. While other teams were pinned down by heavy fire, Mitchell led his men through 6 blocks of hostile territory to reach casualties who would have died without immediate medical evacuation." Harold closed his eyes briefly. Somalia. Even now, nearly 30 years later, he could still smell the dust and cordite, still hear the sound of AK-47 rounds snapping overhead. He could still see the faces of the young Rangers they had pulled out of that hell, Kids who went home to their families because 12 men had decided to walk into an impossible situation. 3 of his team members were wounded during that extraction, General Patterson continued. Mitchell carried one of them, a man named Rodriguez who had taken shrapnel to both legs for over 2 miles while under sporadic fire. He refused evacuation for himself until every one of his men was safely aboard the helicopters. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Chen was staring at Harold with a mixture of amazement and something approaching embarrassment. Judge Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Mitchell, is this accurate?" Harold looked up at her. "Rodriguez was 23 years old, Your Honor. He had a wife and a baby daughter back in Texas. He couldn't walk, and we weren't leaving anyone behind." There was something in the simple way Harold said it that carried more weight than any dramatic speech could have managed. The idea that he wouldn't leave someone behind wasn't presented as heroism, just as an obvious fact, like saying the sky was blue. General Patterson reached into his jacket and pulled out a file folder. "Your Honor, I took the liberty of bringing some of Sergeant Major Mitchell's military records. They're heavily redacted, of course, but they provide some insight into his service." Judge Morrison accepted the folder and opened it. Even with most of the details blacked out, the documentation was impressive. Citations for valor, letters of commendation from generals and cabinet members, records of operations that were identified only by code names and dates. "Operation Gothic Serpent," she read aloud, then looked up. "That was Somalia?" "Among other operations, yes, Your Honor," Harold said quietly. General Patterson nodded. "Sergeant Major Mitchell's team was also involved in Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti, Operation Joint Endeavor in Bosnia, and numerous classified operations that I'm not at liberty to discuss even today." Harold felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid by moving to this small town. He didn't want to be seen as a war hero or a special operations legend. He just wanted to be a man who fixed things around the house, grew tomatoes in his backyard, and occasionally helped his neighbors with their own projects. But secrets had a way of coming out eventually. And now his was filling up a courtroom and changing the way everyone looked at him. Robert Chen, who had been sitting quietly through the entire exchange, suddenly stood up. His face was pale, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. "I'd like to speak with my attorneys for a moment." Judge Morrison nodded. 5-minute recess? We'll continue in 5 minutes." As the courtroom buzzed with conversation, Chen huddled with Harrison and his other lawyer. Harold could see them arguing in whispers, with Chen gesturing emphatically and Harrison shaking his head. Tommy Reeves leaned over to Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, why didn't you tell me about any of this?" Harold shrugged slightly. "Would it have mattered to the property line survey?" "Well, no. But—" "Then it wasn't relevant," Harold said simply. "I bought my property fair and square. The fence was moved onto my land. Those are the facts that matter." General Patterson approached Harold's seat. "Harold, I'm sorry if this wasn't what you wanted. But when I saw that pin, I couldn't let them dismiss you as just some confused old man." Harold looked up at the general. "I know you meant well, Jim, and I appreciate it. But I've been just a regular citizen for 15 years. I kind of liked it that way." "You'll never be just a regular citizen," Patterson said. "Not after what you've done, what you've seen. You can try to blend in, but you'll always be something more." When court reconvened, Chen immediately stood up. "Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement." Judge Morrison looked surprised. "Mr. Chen?" Chen stepped forward, and for the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology, a profound apology." Harold's expression didn't change, but he nodded slightly. "When I moved my fence," Chen continued, his voice growing stronger, "I knew it wasn't exactly on the property line. I told myself it was just a few inches, that it didn't matter. I convinced myself that since you were just one old man living alone, you wouldn't mind or wouldn't notice." He paused, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "I was wrong. I was wrong about the fence, and I was wrong about you. I had no right to take even 6 inches of your land, and no right to assume that your age or your quiet manner meant you didn't deserve respect." Harrison looked like he was about to object, but Chen held up his hand. "David, stop. This isn't about winning anymore." Chen turned back to Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, I will have the fence moved back to the correct property line this week, at my expense. And if you'll allow it, I'd also like to remove the shed that's blocking your view of the mountains." The courtroom was completely quiet. Harold studied Chen's face for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't been present earlier: genuine remorse and respect. "Mr. Chen," Harold said finally, "I appreciate your apology, and yes, I'd like my view back." Chen nodded. "You'll have it. And sir, if there's ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Judge Morrison was clearly moved by the unexpected turn of events. "Well, this is certainly not how I expected this morning to proceed. Mr. Chen, are you withdrawing your claim to the disputed property?" "Yes, Your Honor, completely." "And you're agreeing to move the fence and the shed at your own expense?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison looked at Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, are you satisfied with this resolution?" Harold considered the question. "I am, Your Honor. Thank you." As the formal proceedings concluded and people began to file out of the courtroom, something unexpected happened. One by one, people approached Harold to shake his hand or simply to say thank you. The bailiff, a young veteran himself, was among the first. "Sergeant Major," he said, offering a crisp handshake. "It's an honor." Harold shook his hand. "Just Harold is fine, son." An elderly woman who had been waiting for her own case to be heard stopped beside Harold's seat. "My grandson served in Afghanistan," she said quietly. "Thank you for what you did for boys like him." Harold nodded politely, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the attention. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid for 15 years. General Patterson waited until most of the courtroom had cleared out before approaching Harold again. "How about we grab some coffee and catch up properly?" Harold looked around the nearly empty courtroom, at Tommy Reeves, who was still organizing his papers with a stunned expression, at Judge Morrison, who was watching him with obvious curiosity and respect. "I suppose that quiet retirement I was enjoying is officially over," Harold said with a slight smile. "Probably," General Patterson agreed. "But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. This town could use someone like you. Someone who understands what real service means." Harold stood up slowly, his joints protesting as they always did. "Jim, I came here to get away from being someone special. I wanted to be nobody in particular." "I know," Patterson said, "but maybe being someone special isn't something you can just turn off. Maybe it's who you are, whether you like it or not." As they walked toward the courtroom exit, Harold reflected on the morning's events. In the space of a few hours, his carefully maintained anonymity had been completely shattered. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know about his Delta Force background. There would be questions, attention, probably requests to speak at local events or schools. The quiet life he had built was about to become much more complicated. But as they reached the courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, Harold realized that maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. For 15 years he had been hiding from his past, pretending that the most important chapters of his life had never happened. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to remember that some things were worth standing up for, worth fighting for, even if the battle was just about 6 inches of property line and a view of the mountains. The small pin on his lapel caught the sunlight as they walked down the courthouse steps, its dark surface gleaming with quiet pride. 3 weeks after the courthouse revelation, Harold Mitchell stood in his backyard watching a crew of workers move his neighbor's fence back to its proper location. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn air that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch. Soon, when the shed was removed, he would have his full view back. Robert Chen appeared at the temporary gap in the fence line, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I join you, Harold?" Harold nodded toward the picnic table on his patio. "Sure, have a seat." The 2 men sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the workers measure and mark the correct property boundaries. Their relationship had undergone a complete transformation since that morning in court. What had started as a bitter dispute between neighbors had evolved into something approaching friendship. "I keep thinking about that day in the courtroom," Chen said eventually, "about how wrong I was about everything." Harold sipped his coffee. "We all make assumptions about people. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're not." "But I wasn't just wrong," Chen insisted. "I was arrogant. I saw a quiet old man living alone, and I figured I could take advantage of him. I figured he wouldn't fight back or wouldn't know how." Harold looked at him thoughtfully. "You weren't entirely wrong about that. I wasn't planning to fight very hard." "Why not?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Robert, for 28 years, I fought battles that mattered. Life and death, freedom and oppression, good guys and bad guys. When I retired, I told myself I was done fighting. I wanted peace, quiet, simple problems with simple solutions." He gestured toward the mountains. "I thought a fence line dispute was a simple problem. I thought if I just followed the legal process, presented the facts, justice would prevail. I didn't want to use my background or my connections. I wanted to handle it like a regular citizen." "But you're not a regular citizen," Chen said. "General Patterson was right about that." Harold nodded slowly. "That's what I've been trying to figure out these past few weeks. Whether I can be both things, the soldier I was, and the civilian I want to be." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Harold's front door. Through the house, they could hear voices and what sounded like several people talking at once. Harold sighed. "That's probably another group wanting me to speak at something." Since the courthouse incident, Harold's quiet life had been turned upside down. Word of his Delta Force background had spread through the small town like wildfire. The local newspaper had run a front-page story titled "Hero Next Door," despite Harold's polite refusal to be interviewed. The VFW had asked him to be the keynote speaker at their Veterans Day dinner. The high school ROTC program wanted him to speak to the students. 3 different churches had invited him to share his story with their congregations. Even more overwhelming was the steady stream of visitors to his house. Veterans from surrounding towns drove hours just to shake his hand and share their own stories. Mothers brought their sons who were thinking about military careers. People who had lost family members in various conflicts came to thank him for his service. Harold appreciated their respect and gratitude, but the constant attention was exhausting. He had moved to this town specifically to avoid being in the spotlight. "I'll get it," Chen offered, standing up. "No, it's okay," Harold said. "Part of the new normal, I guess." Harold walked through his house to the front door, where he found a delegation from the town council waiting on his porch. Mayor Patricia Williams stood in front, flanked by 3 council members. "Harold," Mayor Williams said with a warm smile, "I hope we're not interrupting your morning." "Not at all," Harold replied, though privately he was hoping this wouldn't take too long. "What can I do for you?" "We have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you," the mayor said. "Could we come in for a few minutes?" Harold led them to his living room, a modest space furnished with comfortable but simple furniture. The walls were notably free of military memorabilia. No awards, no photographs of him in uniform, no flags or certificates. It was the home of someone who had deliberately chosen to leave his past behind. Mayor Williams got straight to the point. Harold, as you know, the town has been planning a new Veterans Memorial for the past 2 years. We've raised the funds and selected the location in Memorial Park, but we've been struggling with the design and the selection of names to include. Harold nodded politely, but said nothing. After learning about your background, she continued, the council unanimously agreed that we'd like you to head up the memorial committee. We need someone who understands what military service really means, someone the veteran community trusts and respects. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Mayor Williams, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that job. Why not? Because I moved here to get away from being defined by my military service. I wanted to be just another resident, not the local war hero. Councilman Davis, a man in his 50s who had served in the Gulf War, leaned forward. Harold, with respect, that ship has sailed. Whether you like it or not, people in this town now see you as a leader. They look up to you. You can either use that influence for something positive, or you can keep trying to hide from it. Harold walked to his window and looked out at his backyard, where the fence crew was making steady progress. Robert Chen was still sitting at the picnic table reading something on his phone. What exactly would this memorial committee do? Harold asked. Research and compile the names of local veterans from all conflicts, Mayor Williams explained. Design the memorial itself. Plan the dedication ceremony. Make sure it's something that properly honors their service. And if I said no? Then we'd respect your decision, she said. But Harold, we've got veterans in this town from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. They need someone who understands what they've been through, someone who can speak their language. Harold thought about the conversations he'd had over the past few weeks with various veterans who had come to visit. There was Jimmy Martinez, who had driven 3 hours from Denver just to talk to someone who understood what it was like to come home from a war zone. There was Susan Chen, Robert's sister, who had served 2 tours as an Army medic in Iraq and was struggling with nightmares she couldn't explain to her family. There was old Frank Morrison, Judge Morrison's father, who had fought in Korea and never talked about it until he spent an afternoon on Harold's porch sharing stories about cold nights and lost friends. These people were finding in Harold something they hadn't had before, someone who understood, someone who could listen without judgment, someone who had walked similar paths. How much time would it take? Harold asked. A few hours a week, Mayor Williams said. Maybe more when we get close to the dedication. Harold turned back to face the delegation. I'll do it on one condition. What's that? This memorial isn't about me. My name doesn't go on anything special. I'm just another veteran contributing to something that honors all of us. Mayor Williams smiled. Agreed. After the town council left, Harold found Robert Chen still sitting in his backyard, now joined by an elderly man Harold didn't recognize. Harold, Chen said as he approached, I'd like you to meet my father, David Chen. Dad, this is Harold Mitchell. The older man stood up slowly and extended his hand. He was probably in his 80s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Mitchell, David Chen said, my son has told me about you, about what happened in court, and about your military service. Harold shook his hand. Please, just call me Harold. Harold, then. I wanted to thank you for how you handled the situation with my son. Harold looked puzzled. I'm not sure I understand. David Chen gestured for them all to sit down. My son made a mistake with your fence, but more than that, he made a mistake about you as a person. He judged you based on superficial things, your age, your quiet manner, your simple clothes. Robert looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt. When your true background was revealed, the elder Chen continued, you had every opportunity to embarrass him, to make him look foolish and small. You could have demanded more than just having the fence moved. You could have made him pay for his arrogance. That wouldn't have accomplished anything positive, Harold said simply. Exactly, David Chen smiled. You chose grace over vindication. You allowed him to apologize with dignity and to make things right. That shows the character of a true leader. Harold was quiet for a moment. Your son owned up to his mistake and fixed it. That took character, too. David Chen nodded approvingly. I think you two understand each other now. Over the following weeks, Harold found himself settling into a new routine that balanced his desire for privacy with his growing role in the community. He spent mornings working on the Veterans Memorial Project, afternoons tending his garden, and evenings having quiet conversations with the various people who continued to seek him out. The memorial project turned out to be more rewarding than he had expected. Working with other veterans to research and document the military service of their neighbors gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since retiring. They discovered stories that had never been told, heroes who had never been recognized, sacrifices that had been quietly endured for decades. One afternoon, while reviewing old newspaper archives at the library, Harold was approached by Tommy Reeves, the young lawyer who had represented him in court. Mr. Mitchell, Tommy said nervously, I hope you don't mind me bothering you. Not at all, Tommy. What can I do for you? Tommy sat down at the table across from Harold. I've been thinking a lot about that day in court, about how I almost lost your case because I didn't understand who you really were. Harold looked up from the document he was reading. You did fine, Tommy. You presented the facts correctly. But I missed the bigger picture, Tommy said. I treated you like just another client instead of really listening to you, really understanding your situation. What's your point? Tommy took a deep breath. I want to be a better lawyer. I want to learn how to really see people, not just their surface circumstances. Would you be willing to help me? Harold studied the young man's face. Tommy was sincere, eager, and clearly capable of growth. What kind of help are you talking about? I don't know exactly, Tommy admitted. Maybe just talking sometimes, helping me understand how to read people better, how to dig deeper than just the obvious facts. Harold considered the request. Teaching had never been part of his plans for retirement, but there was something appealing about the idea of passing on some of what he had learned over the years. Tell you what, Harold said. Come by my house Saturday morning. We'll start with coffee and see where it goes from there. Tommy's face lit up with gratitude. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate this. That evening, Harold stood on his back porch looking out at his restored view of the mountains. The fence was back in its proper location. The shed was gone, and his sight line to the peaks was clear and unobstructed. The sunset was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Robert Chen appeared at the fence line with his usual evening coffee offering. Mind if I join you for the sunset? Come on over, Harold said. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the light fade from the mountains. You know, Chen said eventually, I've been thinking about what my father said, about grace and dignity. What about it? I think I'm beginning to understand why you didn't want to use your military background in court, Chen said. You wanted to win on the merits of your case, not because of who you used to be. Harold nodded. I wanted to be treated fairly as a regular citizen. I didn't want special consideration because of my past. But you're not a regular citizen, Chen said. You're someone who spent decades in service to something bigger than yourself. That changes you in fundamental ways. Harold thought about that. Maybe, but it doesn't mean I should get special treatment in a property dispute. No, Chen agreed, but it does mean you have something valuable to offer this community. Something more than just being a good neighbor. Harold looked at him curiously. Leadership, Chen explained. Real leadership, based on experience and character rather than position or authority. People in this town are hungry for that. Harold considered his neighbor's words as the last light faded from the sky. Over the past month, he had slowly come to accept that his attempt to completely separate himself from his military past had been unrealistic. That part of his life was too much a part of who he was to simply ignore. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe the skills he had learned, the experiences he had gained, the perspective he had developed could be put to good use in civilian life. Not in dramatic ways, not in life and death situations, but in the small, important work of building and strengthening a community. The Veterans Memorial Project was just the beginning. There would be other opportunities to contribute, to lead, to serve in new ways. Young lawyers like Tommy who wanted to learn. Veterans like the ones he had been meeting who needed someone who understood their experiences. Community problems that could benefit from the kind of clear thinking and decisive action that had been drilled into him over 28 years of military service. "Robert," Harold said finally, "I think I'm starting to understand something." "What's that?" "I spent 15 years trying to stop being a soldier. But maybe the goal shouldn't be to stop being a soldier. Maybe the goal should be to figure out how to be a soldier in peacetime." Chen smiled. "I think that sounds like a pretty good goal." As they headed back to their respective houses, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of anticipation about the future. For the first time since retiring, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not just because it would be peaceful and quiet, but because it would bring new opportunities to contribute something meaningful to the world around him. The small pin on his lapel caught the porch light as he went inside, a quiet reminder that some things were worth carrying forward, even when the mission had changed. Especially when the mission had changed. Harold Mitchell was finally ready to stop hiding from who he was and start figuring out who he could become.